What if the cold husband who seems like your jailer is actually the only one keeping you safe? Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. He offered me a simple silver band in a quiet boardroom, his voice cold and steady. "This is for show," he told me, "to keep them from touching you." But when the storm came, the protection he gave me was entirely real. Take a deep breath. Stay with me, because this story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. The air inside Thorne and Associates tasted like ozone and synthetic pine, a sterile corporate chill engineered to keep employees mildly anxious. I stood behind my desk, staring at the polished glass partitions that separated my small cubicle from the sprawling expanse of the firm. Beyond that immaculate glass, the city wept against the windows in endless, gray streaks of coastal rain. I did not cry. I simply placed my hands flat against the cold surface of my desk, waiting for the adrenaline to recede. The silence in the surrounding office was deafening. My colleagues kept their heads rigidly bowed over their monitors. In a firm ruled by a predator, survival dictated a profound and willful blindness. Minutes ago, in a corner office smelling of expensive cologne and unearned entitlement, Marcus Thorne had made his intentions perfectly clear. Predatory men rarely need to raise their voices when they hold the keys to your livelihood. He had simply leaned across his massive desk, his eyes resting on me with a heavy, suffocating weight, and suggested my upcoming promotion required compromises I was entirely unwilling to make. When I refused and stepped backward toward the heavy oak door, his smile hardened into something sharp and absolute. He told me my botanical designs were replaceable, assuring me that by the end of the day, my name would be blacklisted across every major architectural firm in the Pacific Northwest. He spoke of my career as if it were a fragile glass ornament he was slowly crushing in his fist. Now I was packing my life into a single cardboard box. I ignored the sleek, company-issued laptop. Its blinking cursor felt like an accusation, a reminder of the hundreds of unpaid overtime hours I had poured into designing green sanctuaries for a company that viewed me as a disposable commodity. Instead, my hands moved toward the only object of real, undeniable value I possessed. It was a heavy, worn cedarwood ledger. The leather spine was cracked from years of use, the thick pages slightly yellowed. It had belonged to Julian Vance, my father. Long before he passed away, leaving behind a crushing mountain of medical debts and brilliant, unfinished blueprints, he had taught me how to read the earth. He believed that a garden was not merely an aesthetic choice, but a living, breathing architecture of silence and patience. I opened the ledger. The faint, earthy scent of dried soil, graphite, and cedarwood drifted up, cutting through the sterile office air like a lifeline thrown into dark water. Tucked carefully between the pages of a sketched pavilion was a single pressed fern leaf. It was fragile, its intricate green veins faded to a pale, ghostly brown. Julian and I had found it on a damp afternoon in the Hoh rainforest, when I was just 10 years old, our boots sinking into the wet moss as the forest breathed around us. I carefully lifted the fern leaf, sliding it deep into the breast pocket of my wool coat, directly over my heart. I was leaving behind the salary and the prestige, but I would not leave a single trace of my father's quiet legacy in a room devoid of honor. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of my cubicle. Marcus stood in the doorway, leaning against the metal frame. His gaze swept over my meager possessions, searching for the panic he so desperately wanted to see. He wanted a plea for mercy. "You are making a permanent mistake, Clara," he said softly. The hum of the industrial air conditioning seemed to swallow his words, making them sound entirely private. "The architectural industry here is a small island. Without my recommendation, without my explicit blessing, you won't even find work planting cheap annuals in a suburban strip mall." I kept my eyes firmly on the cedarwood ledger as I placed it into the bottom of the box. I refused to let my voice shake. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. The past 2 years had been a constant barrage of pink collection notices and automated voicemails demanding money I did not have. But this choice, the choice to walk out with my dignity intact, to refuse to become a footnote in his predatory history, was entirely mine. "My work speaks for itself, Mr. Thorne," I replied, my voice miraculously steady. I lifted the box. It was surprisingly light for holding an entire career. Marcus scoffed, a quiet sound vibrating with arrogance. Dignity does not pay off medical liens, Clara. You will find that pride is a very cold companion when the bank calls and the eviction notices arrive. He stepped aside. I kept my chin leveled as I marched down the long, gray corridor. Not a single colleague looked up. The clicking of keyboards continued, a coward's symphony masking my departure. I stepped into the waiting elevator, the heavy steel doors finally sealing away Marcus's suffocating presence. Only then, as the elevator plummeted toward the ground floor, did I let out a jagged breath. I leaned my forehead against the cool metal wall and closed my eyes. The pressed fern leaf rested against my chest, a quiet, fragile weight above my racing heart. I was completely, terrifyingly unmoored. The coastal rain hit me the moment I stepped through the revolving glass doors. It was a steady gray mist that soaked through wool with silent, heavy persistence. I stood beneath the massive concrete awning, the cardboard box heavy in my arms, watching taillights bleed into red smears against the wet asphalt. The crushing reality of my situation began to settle into my bones, like winter stone. Julian's medical debts were not abstract numbers I could ignore. They were persistent threats from collection agencies. They were the very reason I had swallowed my pride and taken a junior position at Thorne's corporate firm, abandoning my dream of historical garden restoration. Now, I had nothing, no income, no prospects, no safety net, just a box of old sketches and a fierce refusal to be compromised. My phone vibrated violently in the pocket of my damp coat. I balanced the box awkwardly against my hip and pulled the device free. The glowing screen displayed a local area code with no caller ID. I considered letting it ring into the void, too exhausted to deal with a debt collector's scripted threats. But something in the persistent vibration made me swipe the screen and lift the phone to my ear. Hello? Clara Vance. The voice on the other end was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of manipulative warmth. It sounded like the quiet rumble of a coming storm, heavy, grounded, and immovable. My name is Christian Sterling. I froze. A chill that had nothing to do with the rain swept down my spine. Sterling. The name was carved into the granite facades of half the commercial real estate in the Pacific Northwest. He was the CEO of the Sterling corporate empire, a man known equally for his intensely private nature and his ruthless efficiency in acquisitions. He was a phantom billionaire, not a man who made direct phone calls to shivering landscape architects standing on a wet sidewalk. Mr. Sterling, I managed to say, gripping the phone tighter. How did you get this number? I make it my business to know when Thorne carelessly discards a valuable asset, he replied smoothly, offering a cold, factual statement. I am aware of what happened in his corner office 20 minutes ago. I am also aware of the blacklist he is currently drafting and circulating with your name on it. A fresh wave of nausea washed over me. If you are calling to confirm that I am now unemployable, Mr. Sterling, you are wasting your valuable time. I am calling? Christian corrected, the steady timbre of his voice cutting through the noise of the traffic, to offer you an absolute solution. I have a black town car waiting for you on the corner of 5th and Pike. The hazard lights are on. Come to my office. We have a contract to discuss. He did not ask if I was interested. The line simply went dead. Through the rain, half a block away, the sleek black town car sat idling by the curb, its amber lights blinking, a silent invitation. The choices laid out before me were stark and terrifying. But as the cold wind whipped around the concrete pillars, I realized I had no choice at all. The ride in the town car was a study in absolute isolation. The interior smelled of dark leather and quiet efficiency. The tinted windows shielded me from the prying eyes of the city, muting the harsh glare of streetlights into soft halos. For 10 minutes, I was neither a victim nor an employee. I was a ghost in transit, clutching a damp cardboard box. The Sterling building was a massive, Gothic light fortress of dark stone, ironwork, and brushed steel, grounded and impossibly heavy against the city skyline. Walking through the double doors felt like stepping to a centuries-old vault. The air here was entirely different from the artificial ozone of Thorne's firm. It was thick and still. It smelled of old paper, polished mahogany, and the faint, grounding aroma of cedarwood. I was escorted up to the top floor by a silent assistant. My damp wool coat clung uncomfortably to my shoulders. I felt entirely out of place. A rain-soaked stray, wandering into a pristine temple of high finance. The assistant opened a heavy set of double doors, stepping back to give me the floor. The boardroom was cavernous and deeply quiet, illuminated by the soft ambient glow of heavy brass library lamps, casting long shadows across the dark paneled walls. At the far end of an imposing 20-foot mahogany table sat Christian Sterling. He was a man who seemed carved from the very stone of his building. His dark suit was immaculate, his posture unyielding. He was finishing a signature on a stack of legal documents, the silver nib of his heavy fountain pen, scratching a steady, rhythmic sound into the silence of the room. "Sit, Clara," he commanded softly, without raising his head. I walked to the nearest high-backed leather chair and lowered myself into it, maintaining a heavily guarded posture. I refused to shrink under the crushing weight of this room, or his reputation. I folded my hands tightly in my lap. Christian finally capped his pen. He laid it precisely parallel to the edge of his leather portfolio, a micro-movement speaking of a mind obsessed with order. When he looked up at me, his eyes were the color of storm-swept slate, dark, unreadable, and entirely still. There was only an intense, clinical focus that made me feel as though my fears were being quietly weighed and measured. "You refused, Thorne," Christian stated, "and as a direct result, you are now effectively locked out of every commercial landscape architecture project in the state." "My personal boundaries are not negotiable," I replied, my voice sharp. "If you brought me all the way here just to remind me of the consequences of my own dignity, you can save your breath." Christian did not blink. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a thick, ivory envelope. He placed his large hand flat against the paper and pushed it slowly across the polished surface of the mahogany table until it rested directly in front of me. "I did not bring you here to remind you of your vulnerability. I brought you here to eliminate it," he said, his low voice carrying a heavy, grounding authority. "Thorne uses the threat of professional isolation to break talented people. I find his methods deeply offensive to my sensibilities." I stared at the thick envelope, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What is this?" "Corporate immunity," Christian replied. Rather than spelling out every detail in a monologue, he outlined the terms of a legally binding contract with precise, clinical efficiency. For the next 12 months, I would be employed as the chief restoration architect for his private, ancestral estate on Bainbridge Island. The position came with full creative control and an unlimited budget. More importantly, he explained to the public, the press, and specifically to Marcus Thorne, I would be known as his fiancé. The word dropped into the quiet, shadow-drenched room, like a heavy stone plunging into a still pond. "Your fiancé? You want a fake engagement? Are you out of your mind?" "I want a shield," Christian corrected smoothly, unbothered by my disbelief. He went on to explain that Thorne only wielded influence over mid-level design firms because they feared his financial retaliation. But the Sterling family owned the debt of half those agencies. If I was publicly attached to him, no one would dare honor the blacklist. My career would remain perfectly intact, and his estate's historic glass conservatory would receive the brilliant restoration it desperately required. "Why?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You don't know me. You owe me absolutely nothing." "I owe a debt to excellence," Christian said softly, his dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "I have seen Julian Vance's old blueprints. I know you possess his archives, his vision, and his unparalleled understanding of soil memory. This is a transaction, Clara. You give me your skill, you give me your time, and in return, I give you an impenetrable wall of safety." I reached out with a trembling hand and traced the sharp edge of the envelope. The paper was highly textured and heavy with implication. It was a business deal, cold, calculated, and entirely sterile. There was no romance here, no messy emotional entanglements. It was a strategic corporate maneuver designed to protect an asset, and yet, listening to the steady rain beat a relentless rhythm against the tall glass windows, I felt a strange, profound sense of physical relief wash over my exhausted body. The crushing weight of Julian's debts, the terror of Thorne's blacklist, the sheer loneliness of the past 2 years. All of it felt momentarily held at bay by the immovable stone presence of the man sitting across from me. Christian laid out his final stipulations. We would not cohabitate in the main house. I would be given private quarters near the conservatory. We would make only a few strategic, highly controlled public appearances to solidify the narrative. And of course, there had to be a ring. He withdrew a small, faded velvet box from his pocket. It looked like something that had been sitting in a dark safe for decades. He placed it on the table between us and flipped the lid open. Resting against the dark satin was a simple silver band. It was not an ostentatious diamond designed to show off vulgar wealth. It was entirely unadorned, elegant, and heavy. A quiet, understated statement of claim, rather than a loud, possessive declaration of ownership. It looked less like jewelry and more like a piece of ancient armor. I need to ensure it fits, Christian said quietly. He did not reach across the table to grab my hand, maintaining the strict boundary he had just established. Instead, he picked up the sleek silver fountain pen. He gestured slightly toward my left hand, which was still resting defensively on the mahogany table. Hesitantly, feeling the strange surrealism of the moment, I extended my hand. Christian leaned forward, his broad shoulders shifting under his suit. He held the silver pen parallel to my ring finger, his dark eyes shifting meticulously between the precise width of the metal barrel and the delicate width of my finger. He did not make physical contact. The space between his silver pen and my bare skin was barely a millimeter, yet it felt like a deliberate canyon of respectful distance. I could hear the faint sound of his measured breathing. I could smell the crisp scent of cedar wood and winter air that clung to his clothes. Say the word, his careful distance seemed to communicate, and I will step away. He studied the measurement for a long moment, his focus absolute. It will suffice, he murmured. He set the pen down with precise care and picked up the silver band. He held it out across the table, resting it on his open palm, offering it to me rather than forcing it upon me. He was giving me the final choice. I looked from the cold metal ring to his stormy eyes. They gave away absolutely nothing. Slowly, I reached out and took the ring from his fingers. The metal was shockingly cold against my warm skin. With a slow, deliberate motion, I slid it onto my left ring finger. It settled into place instantly, carrying a heavy weight that seemed to anchor me to the earth. "This is for show," Christian told me, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet expanse of the boardroom. "To keep them from touching you." I looked down at the silver band. It was a fake ring, a cold corporate shield constructed of metal and legally binding documents. But as the rain continued to weep against the glass outside, masking the sounds of the hostile city below, I realized the profound truth of this bizarre transaction. For the first time since my father died, sitting across from a man I barely knew, I was no longer standing in the storm alone. And perhaps, in this quiet, shadowy room, I had just signed away my fear to find a sanctuary. By the second week of the arrangement, the artificial ozone of the corporate world had entirely faded from my lungs, replaced by the rich, heavy scent of damp earth and ancient glass. The drive to the Sterling estate on Bainbridge Island had felt like crossing into a different century. The main house was a massive, imposing fortress of gray stone, but my focus was entirely on the glass conservatory that sat at the edge of the sprawling property. It was a staggering Victorian structure of wrought iron and clouded glass, half swallowed by overgrown ivy and wild, untamed ferns. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. When I pushed open the heavy iron doors on my first day, the stagnant, humid air rushed out to meet me, carrying their olfactory memory of Julian's old greenhouse. It was a ruin, but it was a beautiful, sleeping ruin, waiting patiently to be woken. I set up my drafting table in the center of the vast space. I carefully placed the cracked cedarwood ledger on the slanted wooden surface, opening it to Julian's meticulous sketches of shade-tolerant perennials. The silver band on my left ring finger clinked softly against the wood. A constant, quiet reminder of the transaction that had bought me this sanctuary. For the first few days I worked in complete isolation. I tore out dead vines, cataloged the surviving flora, and began mapping the new irrigation pathways. I did not see Christian. He remained a phantom, a name on the deed, a protector who existed only in the abstract. I assumed he was busy, dismantling Marcus Thorne's influence in the city, You're enforcing the corporate immunity he had promised me. Then, the evening visits began. It started on a Tuesday. The coastal fog had rolled in off the Puget Sound, pressing a thick, gray blanket against the glass walls of the conservatory. I was kneeling in the damp soil near the entrance, wrestling with a massive piece of rough-hewn slate. It was part of the original paving stones, and it had sunk deep into the mud over the decades. I needed to unearth it to level the pathway. My hands were blistered, my jeans soaked through at the knees. I wedged a rusted iron trowel beneath the edge of the slate, pulling upward with all my weight. The stone groaned, shifted a fraction of an inch, and then sank back into the earth with a wet thud. I let out a frustrated breath, wiping a streak of mud from my forehead with the back of my wrist. You are creating a fulcrum with the wrong angle. The voice was low, resonant, and shockingly close. I jumped, dropping the trowel. Christian Sterling stood in the open doorway of the conservatory. He was dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit that likely cost more than my entire previous salary at Thorne & Associates. The fabric was immaculate, perfectly tailored across his broad shoulders, standing in stark contrast to the untamed, muddy chaos of the greenhouse. He did not look like a man who belonged in a garden. He looked like winter stone, a monolith of high finance and boardroom warfare. I instinctively touched the plain ring on my finger, a nervous habit I had developed to ground myself. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice slightly breathless. "I didn't hear you approach." "It is my property, Clara. I do not generally announce myself to the trees," he replied smoothly, stepping into the humid air of the conservatory. His piercing eyes swept over the massive slate stone, then dropped to my mud-stained hands. I expected him to tell me to hire a contractor. I expected him to pull out his phone and summon a team of landscapers to handle the physical labor, treating my efforts as a quaint, inefficient hobby. That was how powerful men operated. They delegated the dirt. Christian did not reach for his phone. Instead, he reached for the cuffs of his suit jacket. With slow, deliberate movements, he unbuttoned the jacket and draped it carefully over the back of a nearby wrought iron chair. He then unfastened the silver cufflinks at his wrists, placing them neatly in his pocket, and began to roll up the crisp white sleeves of his shirt. He folded the fabric meticulously, exposing thick, corded forearms dusted with dark hair. "What are you doing?" I asked, completely unmoored by the sight. "You are attempting to lift approximately 80 pounds of embedded sedimentary rock with a hand trowel," Christian stated, his tone completely flat, devoid of any mocking condescension. "It requires leverage, and it requires a secondary point of contact." He stepped directly into the mud. The expensive leather of his Oxford shoes immediately sank into the wet, loamy earth, ruining the pristine shine in an instant. He did not even glance down. He crouched beside me, his large frame dwarfing mine, the scent of cedarwood and crisp winter air temporarily overpowering the smell of the damp soil. "Show me where the root is catching," he commanded softly. I was too stunned to argue. I pointed to the thick, gnarled root of a nearby sword fern that had wrapped itself beneath the right corner of the slate. "It's wedged there. I couldn't break the suction of the mud without tearing the root system, and Julian always taught me." I trailed off, realizing I was rambling about my father to a billionaire CEO. "He taught you not to sacrifice the living architecture for the sake of the stone." Christian finished for me, his eyes locking onto mine for a brief, intense second. He had actually read the archives. He had paid attention to my father's philosophy. Christian wedged his large hands directly into the mud. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch at the cold, wet slime that coated his skin and packed itself under his immaculate fingernails. He bypassed the trowel entirely, digging his fingers beneath the heavy edge of the slate. "On 3, he said, his voice dropping an octave as he braced his shoulders. "You pull the root back, I will lift the stone." I nodded, my heart hammering a strange, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I gripped the thick, fibrous root of the fern. 1, 2, 3. Christian exhaled sharply, a guttural sound of raw physical effort. The muscles in his forearms strained, the veins rising prominently against his skin. With a sheer, brute display of strength that completely shattered his sterile corporate image, he wrenched the 80-pound slate paving stone out of the mud. The suction broke with a loud, wet, tearing sound. I quickly pulled the delicate fern root out of the danger zone, pressing it safely against the side of the trench. Christian did not drop the stone. He held it suspended for a moment, his breathing heavy, his white shirt stained with dark smears of earth. Slowly, with total control, he lowered the massive slate onto the dry pathway beside us. He knelt there in the dirt, his hands coated in mud, his chest rising and falling. There was a smear of dark soil across his knuckle. For a long, silent minute, neither of us moved. The only sound was the distant dripping of condensation, falling from the glass ceiling onto the broad leaves of the ferns. I looked at his hands. The man who wielded enough financial power to mark Markstharmish do a single phone call was currently kneeling in the mud, his expensive clothes ruined, simply because I had needed help moving a rock. Not because it was his job, not because it was expected, but because he had seen a barrier in my path and had silently chosen to remove it. "You ruined your shoes," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Christian looked down at his feet, then back up at me. His expression remained entirely stoic, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible softening in those usually guarded depths. "Shoes can be replaced, Clara. The integrity of your father's root system cannot." He stood up, towering over me once again in the dim light of the conservatory. He didn't ask for a towel. He didn't complain about the dirt. He simply walked over to the old brass spigot attached to the brick wall, turned the rusted wheel, and began washing the dark earth from his hands under the freezing, high-pressure stream of water. I remained kneeling by the slate, my fingers resting on the cold, rough-hewn surface of the stone he had just lifted. My breathing was shallow. The forged ring on my finger felt suddenly warm. The absolute, unyielding reality of his protection was no longer just an abstract concept written in a contract. It was physical, it was heavy, and it was terrifyingly gentle. 2 weeks after the incident with the slate stone, the evening visits had become a silent, unbreakable routine. Every night, precisely at 8 o'clock, the heavy iron door of the conservatory would groan open. Christian would step out of his high-stakes world of corporate acquisitions and into my quiet sanctuary of soil and water. We rarely spoke. He did not demand conversation, nor did he expect me to entertain him. He simply existed in my space, an immovable, protective monolith who found strange peace in watching me work. The transition of space was absolute. Outside, he was Christian Sterling, a man who commanded empires and struck fear into the hearts of men like thorn. Inside the glass walls, under the hanging golden lanterns I had strung across the iron rafters, he was simply the man who handed me pruning shears and carried heavy bags of organic compost without being asked. It was late on a Thursday evening when the storm finally broke. The coastal rain did not fall. It attacked. It lashed against the Victorian glass panes of the conservatory, with a furious, drumming intensity, turning the outside world into a chaotic blur of dark water and violently thrashing tree branches. The sound was deafening, a heavy, acoustic isolation that made the interior of the greenhouse feel like a small, fragile submarine submerged at the bottom of a dark ocean. I stood at the long wooden potting bench, my back to the storm, trying to focus on my drafting. I had been tinting a new set of elevation blueprints with watercolors, mapping out the blooming cycles of the shaded understory. My shoulders ached from hunching over the cedarwood ledger for hours. I gathered my used sable hair paintbrushes and dropped them into a large, antique copper basin filled with warm water. The clear liquid immediately bloomed, with dark clouds of forest green and burnt umber. I plunged my hands into the water, rubbing the soft bristles between my thumb and forefinger to work the pigment loose. The smell of wet sable, lavender soap, watercolor binding agent, and the faint metallic tang of the wet copper basin rose into the humid air. The iron door creaked open, the sound barely piercing the roar of the storm. A gust of freezing, rain-soaked wind swept into the conservatory, instantly making the hanging lanterns sway and cast dancing, elongated shadows across the brick floor. Then the heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the cold. Christian walked toward me. His dark wool overcoat was heavily beaded with rain, his dark hair slightly damp, clinging to his forehead. He looked exhausted, the sharp angles of his jaw tight with the residual stress of whatever corporate wars he had waged that day. Yet, as he approached the warm circle of light surrounding my potting bench, The rigid tension in his shoulders seemed to miraculously dissolve. He stopped beside me. He did not say hello. He didn't need to. His presence was a language of its own. I continued washing the brushes, the cloudy water swirling around my wrists. "You shouldn't have walked across the estate in this weather," I murmured, keeping my eyes on the copper basin. "The wind is practically tearing the branches off the old oaks." "I prefer the walk," he replied softly. He slipped out of his wet overcoat, hanging it on a wooden peg by the door, and returned to stand beside me. "The storm is loud. It drowns out the noise of the boardrooms." I pulled a thick, flat wash brush from the water, squeezing the excess moisture from the bristles. Before I could reach for the clean linen towel, resting on the edge of the bench, Christian's large hand moved. He picked up the towel. I froze, my hand hovering over the basin. Water dripped steadily from my fingers, pinging softly against the copper rim. Christian stepped closer, erasing the comfortable distance we usually maintained. The scent of rain-soaked wool, sharp ozone, and the deep, grounding aroma of his cedarwood cologne enveloped me, mixing with the smell of the damp earth and watercolors. He did not ask for permission. He simply wrapped the soft, dry linen towel around my wet, paint-stained hands. The physical contact was shocking in its gentleness. His massive hands, which I had seen effortlessly tear 80 pounds of stone from the mud, now moved with agonizingly slow precision. He pressed the towel against my palms, absorbing the cold water. He didn't rub or scrub. He simply enveloped my hands within the fabric, holding them securely within the heat of his own grasp. For a moment, neither of us breathed. The storm raged against the glass above us, a violent, chaotic counterpoint to the profound, heavy stillness between us. I stared down at our joined hands. The silver band on my left ring finger gleamed dully against the white linen, a stark reminder of the contract that bound us. But there was nothing transactional about the way his thumb slowly, almost unconsciously, stroked the back of my knuckles through the towel. "You were muttering again tonight," Christian said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper that seemed to vibrate directly in my chest. I blinked, slowly pulling my gaze up from our hands to meet his slate-gray eyes. They were entirely focused on me, entirely stripped of their usual clinical detachment. "Muttering?" I repeated, my voice barely working. "When you were reviewing the ledger earlier," he clarified, his thumb still resting gently over my knuckles. "You were listing the understory plantings. You speak to the blueprints when you think no one is listening." A flush of heat crept up my neck. It was an old habit, a coping mechanism I had developed when Julian was in the hospital. I would whisper the names of the plants, as if invoking a protective spell. "I didn't realize you could hear me over the rain. I'm sorry if it was distracting." "It wasn't distracting," Christian said softly. He finally released my hands, stepping back just a fraction of an inch, allowing the cold air to rush back into the space between us. He draped the damp towel carefully over the edge of the copper basin. "You were listing the Polysticum, Munitum, and the Adiantum pedatum." I stared at him in complete, unadulterated shock. My breath hitched. Those were the precise Latin botanical taxonomies for the western sword fern and the northern maidenhair fern. They were highly specific, academic terms that a corporate CEO with no background in botany would have absolutely zero reason to know. "How do you know those names?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "You didn't know the difference between a perennial and an annual when I signed the contract 3 weeks ago." Christian looked down at the cloudy water in the copper basin. For the first time since I had met him, the stoic, unyielding billionaire looked almost hesitant. It was a fleeting shadow of vulnerability, there and gone in a heartbeat, but I saw it. "I spent my evening in the main library," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. "I had my assistant locate a copy of the Flora of the Pacific Northwest." "Why?" I whispered, completely bewildered. "You hired me to handle the restoration so you wouldn't have to think about it." "You don't need to know the Latin taxonomies of my ferns, Christian." He slowly lifted his gaze, his slate-gray eyes meeting mine, with a heavy, devastating intensity. The silence in the conservatory suddenly felt massive, thicker than the humid air, heavier than the rain beating against the glass. "I didn't read it to manage the project, Clara," he said, the words carrying the weight of a confession. "I read it because I wanted to understand what you were saying when you whispered to yourself in the dark." I want to know the language you speak when you are finally at peace." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My heart slammed violently against my ribs, an erratic, terrifying rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the complete shattering of my defensive walls. He hadn't bought me a diamond. He hadn't made a grand, sweeping declaration of affection or demanded my gratitude for saving me from Thorn. Instead, he had spent his limited, fiercely guarded free time silently studying an obscure botanical textbook, simply so he could understand the quiet murmurs of a woman who was supposed to be nothing more than a fake fiancé on a legally binding contract. I looked at the stoic, trauma-walled protector standing before me. The titan who had built an empire of impenetrable glass and steel was deliberately, painstakingly handing me the keys to his own armor. I didn't know what to say. The magnitude of his silent care was too vast, too overwhelming to be met with simple words. So I didn't speak. I simply reached across the potting bench, my fingers trembling slightly, and picked up the damp linen towel. With a slow, deliberate motion, I reached out and gently wiped a stray drop of rainwater from the sleeve of his dark wool suit. It was a tiny, insignificant act of service, but in the quiet sanctuary of the glass conservatory, as the storm raged violently against the world outside, it was my absolute surrender to the truth. The contract was a lie. The silver band was a fake. But the protection he offered and the quiet, undeniable, bond taking root in the damp earth between us was the most real thing I had ever known. The illusion of our contract required a stage, and 2 weeks later, the Pacific Northwest Architectural Design Gala provided the perfect, suffocating theater. The preparation had been entirely silent, a quiet alignment of unspoken boundaries. Earlier that afternoon, a heavy garment bag had been delivered to my quarters near the glass conservatory. Inside hung a structured, midnight blue silk gown that felt more like a suit of armor than a piece of evening wear. It lacked the ostentatious flair of typical socialite fashion, adhering instead to the quiet, unyielding elegance that Christian preferred. When I finally stepped out into the damp evening air, clutching a small silk clutch to my chest, Christian was waiting by the idling town car. He did not offer empty platitudes about my appearance. He did not look at me as if I were a new acquisition. He simply looked at me, his calming stare anchoring my fraying nerves, and opened the heavy passenger door. The drive into downtown Seattle was swallowed by the rhythmic drumming of the coastal rain against the tinted glass. I sat in the deep leather seat, my fingers nervously twisting the cool metal ring on my left hand. The metal was cool to the touch, a heavy reminder of the transaction we had forged. Returning to the corporate architectural sphere felt like walking voluntarily back into a cage. The memory of Marcus Thorne's corner office, the sterile scent of artificial pine, the quiet, suffocating threat to Julian's legacy, sat heavy in my chest. I stared out the window, watching the blurred city lights streak past like melting gold in the rain, wishing I was back among the soil and the roots. "You are overthinking the geometry of the room, Clara," Christian said quietly, his voice cutting through the dark silence of the car. The low timbre of his words vibrated over the ambient hum of the engine. I blinked, turning to look at his sharp profile, illuminated by the passing streetlights. "I am calculating the exit routes. I haven't been in a room with Thorne since the day he drafted the blacklist. I don't know how to play the corporate socialite. I know how to analyze soil acidity and draft grading plans. I don't know how to smile at men who want to erase my work." Christian shifted slightly, the fine wool of his bespoke tuxedo whispering against the leather seat. He did not reach for my hand, maintaining the respectful physical distance we had silently agreed upon. "You do not have to play anything. You are not an employee seeking favor. You are my partner. The only thing required of you tonight is to exist. I will manage the perimeter. No one will breach it." The grand ballroom of the downtown hotel was a cavernous space of mirrored columns and blinding crystal chandeliers that offered absolutely no shadows to hide in. Waiters in crisp white jackets drifted through the crowd, carrying trays of perfectly arranged hors d'oeuvre that no one actually ate. The air was thick, suffocatingly warm despite the industrial air conditioning, smelling of dry gin, wilted white orchids, and the sharp, metallic tang of desperate ambition. It was a sea of black tuxedos and sequined gowns, a carefully curated ecosystem of people who built glass towers while ignoring the soil beneath them. The entire space was a monument to excess, an environment designed to make anyone without a 9-figure net worth feel entirely insignificant. My chest tightened as the sheer volume of the crowd pressed in on us. Christian remained a constant, immovable monolith by my side. In a room full of men wearing ostentatious watches and projecting forced predatory smiles, he was a study in absolute stillness. He did not posture. He did not raise his voice to command attention or perform for the cameras flashing near the entrance. His mere presence dictated the gravity of the room. Executives who usually commanded entire boardrooms stepped aside when we walked past, their eyes darting to the heavy silver band on my finger with a mixture of intense curiosity and veiled hesitation. They saw the ring, and they saw a boundary drawn in steel. Eventually, the sheer political weight of his position required his attention. A regional bank director cornered him near the champagne fountain, visibly sweating as he attempted to pitch a waterfront development. The man was speaking too fast, desperate for a sliver of Christian's influence. Christian cast a single dark glance my way, silently asking for permission to step away. I gave a small nod, retreating toward the quiet sanctuary of a massive floral arrangement near the mirrored wall, grateful for a momentary reprieve from the relentless scrutiny. I placed my untouched champagne flute onto a passing waiter's silver tray. I needed a moment to breathe, to clear the artificial ozone from my lungs and replace it with the memory of the damp earth in the conservatory. I closed my eyes, picturing the intricate fern roots I had been mapping earlier that morning. I thought of the pressed fern leaf tucked safely inside Julian's cedarwood ledger, a fragile reminder of why I endured this hollow spectacle. It is a fascinating strategy, Clara. I will admit I did not foresee you playing this particular card. The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with a cold arrogance I recognized instantly. The muscles in the back of my neck seized. I did not need to turn around to know that Marcus Thorne had found me. The scent of synthetic pine and sharp cologne invaded my personal space, entirely erasing the delicate fragrance of the orchids. My pulse spiked, a sudden, erratic drumming in my ears that threatened to drown out the low hum of the ballroom. I turned slowly, refusing to let my shoulders drop, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me shrink. Marcus stood entirely too close, holding a glass of amber scotch. His smile was razor-thin, his eyes scanning the midnight blue silk of my gown, with a look of calculating disdain. His gaze lingered on the plain jewelry, resting on my left hand, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his polished features. He hated that I had found a way to bypass his authority. He hated that he could no longer snap his fingers and watch my career crumble. He was trying to reclaim the control he felt he had lost, trying to force me back into the subservient role of a desperate junior architect drowning in medical debt. Marcus, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, stripping it of any emotion. I would say it is a pleasure, but we both know I have no patience for empty pleasantries. He let out a short, patronizing laugh, taking another deliberate step forward to close the distance. You look the part, I'll give you that. The dress, the venue, the quiet, obedient posture. But you and I both know this engagement is a fabrication. Christian Sterling does not marry landscape designers who carry mountain-high medical liens. He acquires corporate assets. You are just a temporary accessory he brought along to project a softer image. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. When he is bored of this little charade, your name will still be on my desk. The blacklist is still active, Clara. Your father's pathetic little cedarwood ledger will gather dust in a damp greenhouse, and you will eventually come back to my office, asking for a drafting stool. I opened my mouth to reply, to tell him that Julian's legacy was something his sterile, profit-driven mind could never comprehend. I wanted to tell him that the pressed fern leaf tucked inside those worn pages carried more worth than his entire firm. I wanted to tell him that I would rather starve than draft a single line for his soulless company. But before the words could leave my throat, the temperature in the corner of the ballroom plummeted. A heavy shadow fell over Marcus, completely eclipsing the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers overhead. Christian did not rush over, he did not run, and he certainly did not raise his voice to make a loud, melodramatic scene that would draw the hungry eyes of the press. He simply arrived. He stepped directly into the suffocatingly small space between Marcus and me. It was a masterclass in absolute physical containment. Christian's broad shoulders formed an impenetrable wall of dark wool, his towering frame completely blocking Marcus's view of my face. The sheer physical density of his presence was overwhelming. Marcus stumbled backward, his scotch sloshing violently over the rim of his crystal glass and staining his pristine white cuff. He looked up, his arrogant sneer faltering instantly as he met Christian's slate-gray eyes. Christian stood perfectly still. His hands rested casually in his pockets, but the tension radiating from his massive chest was undeniable. He looked like a mountain preparing to weather a storm. He did not shout. He did not issue threats. His silence was heavy and absolute, pressing down on the smaller executive until Marcus looked visibly pale. Every executive within a 10-foot radius had stopped talking, the ambient noise dying away as they sensed the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus stammered, the smooth arrogance in his voice evaporating into thin, reedy panic. He wiped desperately at his stained cuff. "I was just catching up with my former employee, offering my professional congratulations on the sudden engagement. We were just discussing her father's past projects." Christian stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The silence between them grew so heavy. It felt as though the oxygen was being slowly pulled out of the room. He did not acknowledge the lie. He did not offer a polite corporate deflection to save Marcus's pride. "You mistook her silence for weakness," Christian said, his voice a low, devastating rumble that barely carried over the hum of the gala, yet hit with the weight of cold stone. "That was your final mistake." He didn't wait for Marcus to formulate a response. Christian simply turned his back on the senior partner, effectively erasing the man from our existence. He offered me his arm, his expression softening only marginally as his eyes found mine. I slid my trembling hand through the crook of his elbow, feeling the solid, unyielding heat of his body beneath the bespoke wool. We walked away, leaving the executive who had tormented me standing completely alone in a vacuum of his own irrelevance. We left the suffocating heat of the ballroom behind, stepping out into the freezing coastal night. The ride back to the Sterling estate was swallowed by the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the tinted windows of the town car. I sat in the deep leather seat, my exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline of the evening. Christian sat odds me, his long legs stretched out, his presence a quiet, grounding anchor in the darkness. The scent of cedarwood and cold rain clung to his jacket, entirely washing away the lingering trace of Marcus's artificial cologne. We did not speak. The relief that washed over me wasn't loud or dramatic. Mine was quasi quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The silence was not cold or awkward. It was the profound, heavy stillness of a storm that had finally broken against a seawall. It was the silence of a man who did not demand gratitude for his protection, and a woman who was slowly realizing she no longer needed to carry her armor. When we arrived at the estate, Christian did not escort me to the library or demand a conversation about the night's events. He simply walked me to the edge of the glass conservatory, nodded once, and let me retreat into the safety of my own space. Nearly a month passed before the true weight of that night finally fractured the careful distance between us. The Pacific Northwest autumn deepened, turning the sprawling Sterling estate into a canvas of bruised purples, heavy grays, and rusted golds. For 4 long, quiet weeks, I lived inside the humid, earthy quiet of the glass conservatory, meticulously charting the historic garden restoration. I spent hours mapping the delicate root systems of the ferns, moving heavy slate paving stones, and letting the tactile reality of soil and water anchor my fraying nerves. My father Julian's old cedarwood ledger lay open on the potting bench every day. The pressed fern leaf tucked inside its worn pages acted as a fragile tether to the man who had taught me how to coax life from dead earth. Every evening, just as the coastal fog rolled in and the estate lights flickered on, Christian would arrive. He did not hover. He did not demand conversation or attempt to dissect the trauma of the gala. He simply occupied the space. He would sit in a worn wooden chair near the young jasmine seedlings, reading thick corporate folios or studying the heavy copy of the flora of the Pacific Northwest. The scent of damp soil mixed with the faint trace of his cedarwood cologne, creating a sanctuary where I finally felt safe to breathe. We were two solitary orbits, slowly aligning in the damp, quiet dark, building a bridge composed entirely of silent acts of service. It was during the second month of our contract on an evening, when the rain fell in freezing sheets against the massive glass panes of the conservatory, that the fragile equilibrium shifted entirely. Christian did not come out to the garden. Instead, a quiet message was relayed through the estate staff, asking me to join him in the main house. The grand foyer was an imposing cavern of cold marble and vaulted ceilings, echoing with the sound of my damp boots. The sheer scale of his wealth was always a jarring reminder of the vast, terrifying gulf between our two worlds. This house had been built for dynasties and corporate emperors, not for a landscape designer, who meticulously cleaned dirt from her fingernails every night. Yet, as I walked down the long, dimly lit corridor and pushed open the heavy double doors of his private library, the intimidation factor began to slowly dissolve. The transition of space was immediate. Outside, the storm continued its rhythmic assault. But inside, the world was a warm sanctuary of dark mahogany, floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with leather-bound volumes, and the deep, rich scent of old paper and wood smoke. A low fire crackled lazily in the massive stone hearth, casting warm golden light across the intricate patterns of a Persian rug. Christian stood by the fire. He had discarded his suit jacket, his broad shoulders tight with an exhaustion that seemed to radiate from his very bones. Resting on a low wooden table between two leather armchairs was a single, thick, ivory corporate folio. It looked identical to the one that had held our fake engagement contract weeks ago. He walked over to a crystal carafe, poured a glass of water, and handed it to me without a word. I took a slow sip, letting the cold water soothe my painfully dry throat. "I finalized a transition this afternoon," Christian said softly, his slate-gray eyes locking onto mine with a heavy, devastating finality. He did not offer a boastful speech or project the arrogant pride of a ruthless CEO. Instead, through a few sparse, softly spoken sentences, he completely dismantled my entire reality, and then he fell silent, letting the truth hang in the warm air. Over the past 4 weeks, while I had been quietly tending to jasmine seedlings and tracing Julian's old blueprints, the Sterling Corporation had successfully executed a hostile takeover of Thorne and Associates. The board of directors had been given a strict financial ultimatum. Marcus Thorne was no longer a senior partner. His shares had been forcefully liquidated, and he had been permanently removed from the premises by corporate security. More importantly, Christian had weaponized his immense capital to secure my original professional archives and Julian's architectural legacy records, returning them permanently to my ownership. The crystal glass vibrated slightly against the wooden coaster as I set it down. My mind struggled to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what he had done. The spoken dialogue between us ceased entirely as the crushing weight of his silent, monumental intervention settled heavily over my shoulders. He had spent tens of millions of dollars, leveraging the absolute peak of corporate power, simply to obliterate the man who had threatened my career. I had spent my entire adult life counting pennies, negotiating endless hospital payment plans for Julian, and fighting tooth and nail for tiny scraps of professional respect. The idea that someone could simply write a check to eradicate a systemic threat was fundamentally alien to my worldview. It felt incredibly isolating. It felt like a monumental debt I could never, ever repay. I stepped back from the low table, a sudden, fierce wave of defensive pride flaring in my chest. I refused to touch the ivory folder. I wanted to tell him that I had not signed the contract, so he could fight my battles with his checkbook. I needed to complete the historic garden restoration on my own terms, to prove that Julian's legacy was worth more than Marcus's petty threats. If he just bought my safety, I hadn't earned it. I was terrified of becoming nothing more than a liability he had paid to protect. I braced myself for the anger. I waited for the powerful CEO to remind me of my place, to demand gratitude for his massive financial sacrifice, to tell me how foolish I was for rejecting his protection. But Christian did not react with anger. Instead, the formidable, untouchable titan did something that completely shattered my defensive walls. He bypassed the low table and sat down heavily in the armchair directly across from me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his broad shoulders dropping as he buried his face in his hands for a brief, exhausted second. When he finally looked up, the stoic corporate armor was entirely gone. His storm-swept eyes were raw, filled with a deep, quiet desperation that made the breath catch painfully in my throat. He looked like a man who had conquered the world, only to realize the one thing he wanted could not be bought. "I did not buy that firm to fight your battles, Clara," he whispered, his voice dropping to a rough, broken timbre that echoed in the quiet library. "You won your battle the day you walked out of his office with your dignity intact." He reached across the space between us. He didn't reach for my hands, respecting the physical boundary of my panic. Instead, he gently tapped his long index finger against the thick ivory folder. "I bought it to dismantle the battlefield," he continued, the intensity in his gaze holding me completely paralyzed. The rest of his explanation washed over me, not as a corporate strategy, but as a profound, humbling confession. He made me understand that men like Marcus did not respect invisible boundaries. They did not learn from a quiet reprimand at a gala. They only understood absolute structural ruin. If Christian had simply intimidated him that night in Seattle, I would have spent the rest of my career looking over my shoulder. I would have carried the silent anxiety of Thorne's retaliation every time I opened that cedarwood ledger in the conservatory. Christian hadn't purchased his company to own me or to make me indebted to him. He had meticulously cleared the dangerous debris from my path, so I would never have to waste another ounce of energy defending my basic right to exist in my own life. I stared at the man sitting across from me, the sheer scale of his silent devotion washing over me like a warm, heavy tide. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It watches from the shadows, dismantling the threats you are too exhausted to fight, just so you can finally breathe. My pride, the fierce defensive shield I had carried, like a weapon since Julian passed away, suddenly felt entirely unnecessary in this room. I looked down at the simple silver band resting on my finger. It was supposed to be a fake corporate shield. But looking at Christian, a powerful man who had willingly leveraged his entire empire, just to ensure I could plant Jasmine's seedlings in peace, I realized the absolute truth. I reached across the low mahogany table. My fingers trembled slightly as I bypassed the corporate folio entirely. Instead, I rested my hand gently over his. His skin was warm, his knuckles slightly rough from the days he had spent, helping me move stone in the garden. He turned his palm upward, his large fingers instinctively curling around mine, anchoring me firmly to the earth. The rain outside the window seemed to fade away, leaving only the steady, grounding rhythm of his breathing. We were no longer playing a part for the cameras or the corporate world. We were just two guarded souls sitting in a quiet library, finally deciding to drop our armor. "You burned down an entire corporate firm," I whispered, the silence in the library wrapping around us like a thick, protective blanket. Christian looked down at our joined hands, his thumbs slowly, reverently tracing the edge of the fake silver band. "I would burn down the rest of the city if it meant you could finally work in the quiet." The absolute stillness of the main library held us for a long time. The heavy mahogany walls, lined with centuries of leather-bound history, seemed to absorb the profound weight of his confession. But the formal grandeur of the estate's inner sanctum had never been my space. It belonged to the billionaire, to the corporate titan who could erase a corrupt firm with a single signature. I needed the earth. I needed the quiet, living sanctuary where I could actually process the terrifying, beautiful reality of my newfound freedom. Slowly, I withdrew my hand from his warm grasp. I did not pull away in fear, but with a silent, unspoken invitation. I stood up from the low wooden table, my legs feeling strangely light, entirely unburdened by the crushing debts and professional terrors that had chained me for years. Christian did not question the movement. He simply stood when I did, a towering shadow of dark wool and quiet devotion, following me as I walked out of the cavernous room. The antechamber connecting the main residence to the glass conservatory was a hybrid space, a cozy, rustic library, where Julian's old architectural texts met the damp, humid air of the greenhouse. The floor here transitioned from polished hardwood to rough, uneven flagstone. Wooden shelves bowed under the weight of botanical encyclopedias, terracotta pots, and bundles of dried lavender hung from the exposed cedar rafters. It smelled of old paper, rich loam, and the sharp, clean ozone of the passing coastal storm. I walked directly to the heavy potting bench situated under the soft ambient glow of a wrought iron lantern. Resting on the wooden surface were 3 small, fragile seedlings of night-blooming jasmine. I had cultivated them from frail cuttings, coaxing them back to life through weeks of patient, silent care. They were delicate, requiring a specific balance of alkaline soil and warmth, much like the fragile trust that had grown between the man standing behind me and the guarded woman I used to be. I plunged my bare hands into a burlap sack of organic compost, letting the dark, cool earth coat my fingers. The tactile sensation was immediate and grounding. I needed the dirt under my nails to remind me that as I was still rooted in the physical world, even after Christian had systematically altered the entire trajectory of my life. I scooped the soil into a weathered ceramic pot, my movements slow and deliberate. Christian leaned against the wooden doorframe, watching me in absolute silence. He had abandoned his suit jacket entirely, the crisp white fabric of his dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. The formidable, stone-carved CEO was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, exhausted man who simply wanted to exist in the warm, humid air of my sanctuary. The golden light from the lantern cast deep, softening shadows across the sharp angles of his jaw. He did not look at the intricate root system I was untangling. His slate-gray eyes were fixed entirely on my face, reading the subtle shifts in my expression with the same meticulous attention he applied to international acquisitions. "You do not have to hide in the soil tonight, Clara," he murmured. His voice was a low, resonant hum that blended perfectly with the distant drumming of the rain against the glass roof. "I am not hiding," I replied softly, pressing the delicate roots of the jasmine into the dark earth. "I am anchoring myself. The world you operate in is vast and terrifying. You rewrite reality with a pen. Out there you are untouchable, but in here..." I paused, picking up a small copper watering can and tipping a thin, steady stream of water over the freshly packed soil. "In here, you are just a man who ruins his expensive shoes in the mud to help me lift a stone." Christian stepped away from the doorframe. He crossed the small, flagstone floor of the adjoining library, erasing the careful physical distance we had maintained for months. The scent of cedarwood and winter rain wrapped around me, cutting through the heavy floral sweetness of the jasmine. He stopped directly beside the potting bench. Standing so close, I could feel the radiant heat of his large frame. I set the copper watering can down. My hands were covered in dark, damp earth. I kept my gaze fixed on the small green leaves of the seedling, suddenly hyper-aware of the erratic, hammering rhythm of my own heart. The corporate contract that had bound us was entirely obsolete. The threat was gone. The fake engagement was no longer required to serve as a shield against a hostile industry. We were standing in the quiet aftermath of a war he had silently won on my behalf, leaving us with nothing but the raw, terrifying truth of our proximity. Christian reached out. He did not care about the mud coating my skin. He gently took my left hand, his large, warm fingers curling around my dirty palm, holding it with a reverence that made my breath catch painfully in my throat. He looked down at the simple, unadorned metal resting on my ring finger. It had been my armor. It had been the cold, legally binding artifact that allowed me to sleep at night without fear of professional ruin. But now, nestled against my skin, it felt like a barrier. It was a lie standing between two people who were desperately tired of pretending. "This was a transaction," Christian whispered, his thumb slowly brushing against the cold silver edge. "It was designed to project an illusion of ownership to keep the wolves away. But there are no more wolves, Clara. I eradicated them, and I will not build a life with you based on an illusion." He shifted his grip, his thumb and forefinger lightly pinching the sides of the silver band. His massive, capable hand, a hand that routinely dismantled empires and commanded thousands, trembled slightly. It was a microscopic physical betrayal of his stoic exterior, a profound, undeniable proof of his vulnerability. "Tell me to stop," he breathed, the words barely audible over the steady patter of the rain. His intense eyes lifted to meet mine, entirely stripped of their protective walls, asking for my absolute, self-authorized consent. Tell me you still need the shield, and I will never touch it. But if you are ready to walk out of the fortress, let me take it back. The silence in the rustic library stretched into a heavy, suspended eternity. I looked into the eyes of the man who had asked for nothing, who had demanded no gratitude for his massive sacrifices, who had simply provided a quiet, unwavering sanctuary when the rest of the world wanted me to shrink. I didn't want to be protected from a distance anymore. I wanted to be known. Take it, I whispered, my voice trembling but entirely certain. Christian exhaled a jagged, uneven breath. With agonizingly slow precision, he slid the fake silver band off my finger. The friction of the cold metal gave way to the sudden, shocking warmth of his bare skin against mine. The physical absence of the ring felt incredibly heavy, leaving me completely unmoored and exposed. But before the panic of that exposure could set in, Christian enveloped my entire hand within his own, replacing the cold corporate metal. With the steady beating pulse of his genuine devotion, he placed the silver band on the wooden potting bench, abandoning it beside a rusted trowel and the damp soil. It clinked softly against the wood, a dead artifact of a transaction that no longer mattered. He didn't pull out a velvet box. He didn't produce a massive, ostentatious diamond to replace the silver band. He knew that material wealth was entirely meaningless to me, that grand gestures of luxury belonged to the sterile world we were deliberately leaving behind. Instead, he took a step backward, leading me away from the potting bench and out of the flagstone antechamber. We stepped fully into the sprawling expanse of the glass conservatory. The humid air enveloped us, thick with the scent of wet ferns, moss, and the deep, rich aroma of the ancient earth. The hanging wrought iron lanterns cast a warm, golden illumination over the chaotic, wild beauty of the historic garden we had spent the past 2 months restoring together. Christian stopped in the center of the main dirt pathway, without a single word of hesitation, without a single thought for the expensive tailored trousers he wore. The untouchable titan of the Pacific Northwest lowered himself to the ground. He knelt in the soft, damp soil of the conservatory, the sheer visual impact of the moment completely shattered. Whatever remained of my defensive armor, my hands flew to my mouth to stifle a sudden, overwhelming sob. This was a man who commanded absolute authority, a man who forced senior executives to tremble with a mere glance. Yet here he was, sinking into the wet mud among the ferns and the jasmine, willfully surrendering every ounce of his pride, his power, and his control, simply to look up at me from a place of absolute humility. He held both of my dirt-stained hands in his, anchoring me to the ground as I wept softly in the quiet dark. "I do not have another ring for you tonight," Christian said, his voice thick with an emotion that threatened to break his stoic composure. "I refuse to offer you anything purchased with corporate wealth. You are not an acquisition, Clara. You are the architect of my peace." He bowed his head slightly, pressing his lips against the mud-stained knuckles of my left hand. The contrast of his gentle reverence against the gritty earth on my skin was the most profoundly beautiful thing I had ever experienced. "I am asking for a real chance," he continued, looking back up into my tear-filled eyes. "I am not asking to be your protector or your shield or your benefactor. I am asking for the absolute privilege of sitting beside you in the dirt. I want to build a life where the silence is a choice, not a defense mechanism. I want to learn the Latin names of every plant you grow. I want to be the man who washes your paintbrushes when your hands are too tired." The tears spilled over my eyelashes, cutting warm tracks down my cheeks. The heavy, crushing weight of Julian's debts, the terror of professional isolation, the deep, aching loneliness of carrying my burdens alone. It all dissolved into the damp earth beneath our feet. I was no longer a victim surviving in a hostile world. I was a woman standing in a sanctuary, fiercely loved by a man who respected my boundaries more than his own pride. I didn't answer him with a speech. Words felt entirely inadequate, a clumsy, inefficient translation of the profound warmth expanding in my chest. Instead, I let go of his hands and dropped to my knees in the mud directly across from him. The wet earth soaked instantly through the fabric of my jeans, but I didn't care. I reached forward, wrapping my arms tightly around his broad, muscular shoulders, burying my face in the curve of his neck. He let out a low, shuddering breath, his massive arms wrapping around my waist, pulling me securely against his chest. We knelt there together in the center of the glass conservatory, surrounded by the quiet, living breath of the ferns, our clothes ruined, our corporate armor entirely abandoned. We were just two broken people who had found a way to rebuild each other from the splinters up. Hours later, the violent coastal storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a gentle, rhythmic drizzle that pattered softly against the vaulted glass ceiling. The heavy wrought iron lanterns had been dimmed to a low, intimate amber glow. In the far corner of the greenhouse, resting on a sturdy wooden crate we used for transporting soil, sat a small, rusted electric hot plate. It was a remnant of Julian's old setup, an appliance I had salvaged to bring a tiny piece of my past into this massive estate. I stood by the hot plate, listening to the soft, comforting hiss of the water, boiling in a battered aluminum kettle. I carefully measured out a handful of dried chamomile flowers and fresh peppermint leaves, dropping them into 2 chipped earthenware mugs. They were incredibly ugly, mismatched cups that possessed absolutely zero monetary value, but they were heavy, thick, and retained heat perfectly on freezing coastal nights. Christian sat cross-legged on a faded wool blanket we had spread out over the dry portion of the dirt pathway. He had rolled his ruined trousers up to his calves, his expensive Oxford shoes discarded somewhere near the ferns. He was leaning back against the brick base of a large planter, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. The deep lines of corporate stress that usually framed his mouth were entirely gone. Replaced by an expression of profound, unguarded peace, the kettle whistled a low, gentle note. I poured the boiling water into the chipped mugs, watching the steam rise in thick, curling ribbons toward the glass roof. The sweet, herbal scent of chamomile and mint mixed beautifully with the earthy aroma of the greenhouse and the lingering trace of Christian's cedarwood cologne. I carried the mugs over to the blanket, carefully navigating the uneven dirt floor. I handed one to the man who had dismantled my fears, who opened his eyes and offered a soft, quiet smile that completely transformed the harsh angles of his face. His large hands wrapped around the small earthenware cup, entirely unbothered by its lack of elegance. I sat down beside him, pulling my knees to my chest, letting the radiant heat of the mug warm my damp palms. We didn't speak. We didn't need to discuss the future, or the destruction of Marcus's firm, or the logistical realities of dismantling a fake public engagement. All of that belonged to a noisy, chaotic world that existed outside the heavy iron doors of our sanctuary. Christian shifted slightly, closing the small gap between us. He rested his broad shoulder against mine, a solid, immovable anchor in the quiet dark. I leaned my head against him, feeling the steady, reassuring thud of his heartbeat through his cotton shirt. I took a slow sip of the hot tea, letting the warmth spread deep into my chest. I looked around the glass conservatory, at the thriving sword ferns we had saved, at the newly planted, night-blooming jasmine that would soon fill the air with its heavy fragrance, and at the worn cedarwood ledger resting safely on the potting bench. I had spent so much of my life running from debt, fighting for a scrap of dignity, terrified of being erased by powerful men who viewed people as disposable assets. I had built massive, impenetrable walls around my heart, convinced that survival meant absolute isolation. But as I sat in the dirt with a man who had willingly surrendered his entire empire just to ensure I could drink my tea in peace, I realized that true strength did not lie in remaining untouched. It lay in having the courage to let someone step inside your walls and help you tend to the garden. Sometimes, the most profound vows are not spoken in grand cathedrals or drafted in legally binding corporate contracts. Sometimes, they are simply the act of boiling water in the middle of the night, sitting in the mud and choosing to stay when the silence finally sets in. I closed my eyes, listening to the gentle rain above us, entirely unmoored from my past and perfectly anchored in my present. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.